Have you ever been in a situation where someone's true character showed itself in the worst possible moment? Because what happened that Tuesday evening at Rivington's changed everything I thought I knew about power, protection, and what it means when someone decides you're worth defending. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the mahogany tables as Zara Williams balanced 3 plates of perfectly plated salmon along her left arm. 6 months working at Rivington's had taught her to move with practiced grace between tables crowded with Portland's elite, men in $1,000 suits and women dripping in jewelry that cost more than her annual salary. She'd learned to smile through condescension, to nod politely when patrons spoke to her like she couldn't possibly understand their sophisticated conversations about wine pairings and stock portfolios. Table 12 had been difficult from the moment the 3 men sat down. Marcus Rothwell, a real estate developer whose face appeared regularly in the society pages, had made it clear he found her presence amusing in the way wealthy white men often did when served by young black women. His companions, equally affluent and equally comfortable with casual cruelty, had laughed at his comments about her appearance and questioned her recommendations with the kind of skepticism that had nothing to do with her knowledge and everything to do with her skin color. Zara had endured worse. Working her way through community college while supporting her younger brother Isaiah meant swallowing pride daily, accepting that some battles weren't worth fighting when rent was due and Isaiah needed textbooks. She delivered their appetizers with professional efficiency, refilled their wine glasses without comment when Marcus deliberately knocked over his water glass, and maintained her composure when his hand grazed her thigh as she leaned into clear plates. But Marcus Rothwell wasn't satisfied with subtle humiliation. "You know," Marcus said as she approached with their entrees, voice carrying across nearby tables, "I've always wondered if the service here matches the premium we pay. Think you can handle real customer service, sweetheart?" His tone dripped with implication that made Zara's stomach clench, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course, sir. How can I assist you tonight?" "Well," he leaned back in his chair, studying her with calculating eyes, "why don't you come a little closer? I'd like to discuss the wine selection privately." The other patrons had gone quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her professional distance. "I'd be happy to recommend wines from here, sir. Our sommelier has excellent suggestions for your meal." Marcus's expression darkened. "When I ask for something, I expect cooperation. You people are always so difficult." The slur hung in the air like poison. Zara's hands tightened imperceptibly on her tray, but years of experience kept her voice steady. "I apologize if there's been any misunderstanding, but I need to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with all guests." That's when Marcus Rothwell showed his true nature. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood, and stepped directly into Zara's space. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the meanness radiating from him as he grabbed her wrist with enough force to make her gasp. "Listen here, you arrogant little bitch. I didn't come to this establishment to be lectured about boundaries by the help." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Servers froze mid-step, other diners turned to stare, and management nowhere to be seen. Zara tried to pull away, but Marcus's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her wrist hard enough to bruise. She could feel her professional mask slipping, panic rising as she realized how isolated she was despite being surrounded by people. "Sir, please let go of me," she said quietly, trying not to escalate the situation further. Instead, Marcus shoved her backward with both hands. Zara stumbled, her feet tangling in the carpet as she fought for balance. The tray flew from her hands, plates crashing to the floor in an explosion of ceramic and food as she fell hard against the edge of a nearby table. Pain shot through her ribs where she struck the corner, her palms scraping against broken dishes as she tried to catch herself. The humiliation burned worse than the physical pain as she lay there, professional dignity shattered along with the plates scattered around her. Marcus stood over her, satisfaction evident in his smirk. "Maybe now you'll remember your place." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then came the sound that would change everything. Click. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the entrance, where a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit had just locked the front door. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention even in expensive restaurants full of powerful people. But it was his eyes that made Zara's breath catch. cold gray eyes that swept the room with calculating precision before settling on Marcus with the kind of focus that suggested violence was not just possible, but inevitable. Dante Moretti had been dining alone at table 6, observing the evening's entertainment with the detached interest of someone accustomed to watching human behavior unfold. He'd noticed the young waitress earlier, impressed by her grace under pressure as she navigated increasingly hostile customers with professional composure. There was something about her quiet dignity that reminded him of his own mother, the way she'd maintained her pride even when his father's enemies tried to diminish her. When Marcus Rothwell put his hands on her, something primal and dangerous awakened in Dante's chest. "Nobody moves," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. The authority in those 2 words froze every person in the restaurant, servers and patrons alike recognizing instinctively that they were now in the presence of someone who wielded power like a blade. Dante walked slowly toward table 12, his expensive shoes silent on the carpet. Marcus had gone pale, perhaps finally recognizing the man whose name appeared in whispered conversations throughout Portland's underworld. The real estate developer's companions had shrunk back in their chairs, suddenly finding their wine glasses fascinating. Zara remained on the floor, watching this tall stranger approach with movements that suggested controlled violence. She should have been terrified, but something in his demeanor, the cold fury directed entirely at Marcus, made her feel safer than she had since the confrontation began. "Marcus Rothwell," Dante said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Real estate developer, city planning commission member, married to Senator Patricia Rothwell. 3 children at private schools in Lake Oswego." The level of specific detail made Marcus's face go ashen. "How do you?" Dante ignored the question, crouching gracefully beside Zara. His touch was gentle as he helped her sit up, gray eyes quickly assessing her injuries. The contrast between his tenderness toward her and the menace he projected toward Marcus was striking. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, and Zara found herself nodding honestly instead of offering the automatic denial service industry workers learned to give. "My ribs," she managed, wincing as she tried to straighten. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stood slowly, turning back toward Marcus with the kind of calm that preceded storms. "You put your hands on her." It wasn't a question. Marcus stammered something about misunderstandings and appropriate responses, but Dante raised one hand, and the words died in the man's throat. "Everyone in this room just witnessed you assault a young woman doing her job. You used racial slurs, you grabbed her against her will, and you physically attacked her when she maintained professional boundaries." Dante's voice remained conversational, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Did I miss anything?" The restaurant manager finally appeared from the kitchen, took one look at the scene, and immediately retreated. Other staff members pressed themselves against walls, understanding instinctively that this was not their conflict to enter. Regular diners sat frozen at their tables, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to do anything that might draw attention from the man who had locked them all inside. Marcus tried to bluster. "Now see here, I don't know who you think you are, but I won't be threatened by some." The words died as Dante stepped closer, moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence. "I think, Marcus, that you should be very careful about your next words. You've already demonstrated poor judgment tonight." 2 men in dark suits entered through the kitchen, moving with purpose toward table 12. They flanked Marcus without touching him, but their presence made it clear that his options had narrowed considerably. "Here's what's going to happen," Dante continued in the same mild tone. "You're going to apologize to this young lady. Then you're going to compensate her for this evening's wages, her medical expenses, and her pain and suffering. After that, you're going to leave Portland for an extended vacation, perhaps somewhere with fewer opportunities for you to embarrass yourself." Marcus's voice came out as a croak. "You can't just." Dante smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than his earlier anger. "Marcus, I locked the doors of this restaurant. Every person in here is now part of a private conversation. No cameras, no witnesses, no one going anywhere until we resolve this situation to my satisfaction." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "I absolutely can." The silence stretched until Marcus broke, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of recognition that he had severely miscalculated his opponent. He turned toward Zara, who was still sitting on the floor surrounded by broken dishes, and mumbled something that might have been an apology. Louder, Dante instructed. And with sincerity. I'm sorry, Marcus said more clearly, though his eyes couldn't quite meet Zara's. I was inappropriate and wrong. Dante nodded toward one of his men, who immediately approached Marcus with a tablet. You'll transfer $50,000 to her account right now. Consider it a down payment on learning basic human decency. Marcus's hands shook as he entered his banking information, the amount clearly painful but not devastating enough to refuse given the circumstances. The transaction completed with a soft chime that echoed unnaturally loud in the silent restaurant. Now leave, Dante said simply. And Marcus, if I hear about you bothering service workers anywhere in this city again, our next conversation will be considerably less civilized. Marcus and his companions fled toward the door, which one of Dante's men unlocked just long enough for their exit before securing it again. The restaurant remained frozen, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Dante returned his attention to Zara, extending his hand to help her stand. She accepted, surprised by the warmth of his palm against hers, the careful strength that lifted her without jarring her injured ribs. Standing close to him, she caught the scent of expensive cologne and something else, something that suggested power and danger kept carefully controlled. Thank you, she said quietly, meaning it more than any words she'd ever spoken. Dante studied her face, taking in her composure despite the ordeal, the way she held herself with dignity even disheveled and hurt. What's your name? Zara Williams. Zara, he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. I'm Dante Moretti, and I think you and I should have a conversation about your future employment opportunities. The way he said it, like a man accustomed to solving problems decisively, made something flutter in Zara's chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way he'd stepped into her defense without hesitation. She had no idea that accepting his offer would change absolutely everything about her life, or that the man who'd locked the doors to protect her would soon be the one holding the key to her heart. The paramedic's hands were gentle as she examined Zara's ribs, but each prod sent sharp pain through her torso that made her wince. The ambulance sat parked outside Rivington's, its red and white lights painting the brick facade in alternating colors while curious onlookers gathered behind police tape that had appeared with surprising speed. Bruised, but not broken, the paramedic announced, wrapping Zara's scraped palms in gauze. You should ice the ribs tonight and see a doctor if the pain worsens. The abrasions will heal in a few days. Dante stood nearby, speaking quietly into his phone while keeping Zara in his peripheral vision. She caught fragments of his conversation, words like contained and handled that suggested Marcus Rothwell's evening was far from over. The two men in dark suits had vanished along with Marcus, but Dante's presence remained commanding even as he coordinated whatever consequences awaited the man who had attacked her. Thank you, Zara said to the paramedic, accepting the packet of aftercare instructions. The woman smiled sympathetically and packed her equipment, leaving Zara sitting on the ambulance bumper trying to process what had just happened. An hour ago, she'd been serving dinner to difficult customers, a routine evening in a job that paid her bills and kept Isaiah in college. Now she was injured, unemployed, and somehow under the protection of Portland's most notorious figure. Dante finished his call and approached, his gray eyes assessing her condition with the same careful attention he'd shown during the confrontation. How are you feeling? Sore, she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. She should be giving him the polite response service workers learned to offer, the automatic everything's fine that kept situations from becoming complicated. But something about Dante's direct gaze made evasion feel pointless. That's understandable. He settled beside her on the ambulance bumper, his expensive suit incongruous against the emergency vehicle's utilitarian backdrop. We need to discuss your employment situation. Zara's stomach clenched as reality hit her. She'd been so focused on the immediate aftermath that she hadn't considered the inevitable consequences. Marcus Rothwell was wealthy, connected, the kind of man restaurants couldn't afford to anger. Her being right wouldn't matter when management calculated the cost of supporting her versus cutting their losses. As if summoned by her thoughts, James Morrison, Rivington's general manager, emerged from the restaurant with the expression of a man about to deliver bad news. He approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with Dante's presence, but unable to avoid the conversation any longer. Zara, James began, his voice artificially sympathetic, I need to speak with you about tonight's incident. She already knew. The tight expression around his eyes, the careful distance he maintained, the way he avoided looking directly at her all signaled what was coming. After 6 months of reliable service, stellar customer reviews, and never missing a shift, she was about to be sacrificed to avoid complications. Given the disruption to our dining room and the potential for ongoing issues, James continued, we feel it's best if we part ways. Effective immediately, we'll provide 2 weeks severance and positive references for future employment. The words hit like physical blows. Zara felt her carefully constructed life beginning to crumble, visions of unpaid rent and Isaiah's tuition bills flooding her mind. She'd done nothing wrong, had maintained professionalism even under attack, but Marcus Rothwell's wealth and influence made her expendable. That won't be necessary, Dante said quietly, his voice cutting through Zara's rising panic. His tone remained conversational, but James visibly paled at the underlying steel. Ms. Williams will be starting new employment tomorrow morning. Dante's phone buzzed with a text, and he glanced at the screen before standing smoothly. Your ride is here, he said to Zara, nodding toward a black sedan that had pulled up to the curb. We'll continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable. Zara hesitated, recognizing the moment her life would irrevocably change direction. Accepting Dante's offer meant entering a world she'd only heard about in whispered conversations, aligning herself with a man whose reputation carried equal parts fear and respect. But James Morrison's dismissal had stripped away her illusions about safety in conventional employment. When powerful men decided to destroy you, respectability offered no protection. The sedan's driver held the door open, waiting patiently as Zara made her choice. Dante didn't pressure her, didn't make demands or threats. He simply stood there, offering an alternative to the wreckage of her current situation. She accepted his hand as he helped her into the car, surprised again by his careful strength, the way he ensured she didn't jar her injured ribs as she settled into leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Dante slid in beside her, giving the driver an address she recognized as her own. How do you know where I live? She asked as they pulled into traffic. Dante's smile held no threat, just acknowledgement of her intelligence. You filled out employment paperwork at Rivington's. Standard background verification. He paused, studying her face. I also know you support your younger brother's education at Portland State, that you've worked 3 jobs while completing your own degree in business administration, and that you've never missed a rent payment despite financial pressures that would break most people. The level of detail was both impressive and unsettling. Zara realized she'd underestimated how thoroughly Dante operated, how completely he gathered information before making decisions. It should have been frightening, but somehow his knowledge of her struggles felt more like recognition than violation. Why are you helping me? She asked directly. Because Marcus Rothwell isn't finished with you, Dante replied with the same directness. Men like him don't accept humiliation gracefully. He has connections throughout the city, enough influence to ensure you never work in Portland's service industry again. He paused, letting that reality sink in. Unless, of course, you're under my protection. The sedan pulled up outside her apartment building, a converted warehouse in southeast Portland that housed mostly students and young professionals. Zara looked at the familiar brick facade, wondering if she'd ever see it the same way again. Her sanctuary was about to be invaded by considerations of safety and protection that she'd never needed to contemplate. Pack whatever you need for a few days, Dante instructed gently. You and your brother will be staying somewhere more secure while we establish new arrangements. Panic flared in Zara's chest. Isaiah didn't know about tonight's events, had no idea his sister had been attacked or that their lives were about to change completely. He was probably upstairs working on homework, focused on his engineering coursework, trusting that Zara would continue handling everything as she always had. I can't just disappear, she protested. Isaiah has classes, a routine. He doesn't understand this world. Dante's expression softened slightly. He'll be safer once he does understand. Marcus Rothwell knows about your brother, knows you'll do anything to protect him. That makes Isaiah leverage. The words sent ice through Zara's veins. She'd been naive to think the attack would end with Marcus's humiliation. Wealthy men with wounded pride and political connections didn't simply accept defeat and move on. They retaliated, struck at vulnerabilities, destroyed everything their targets valued. "What kind of employment are you offering?" she asked, recognizing that resistance was pointless. Dante had accurately assessed her situation, understood that she had no real choice beyond accepting his protection or watching everything she'd built crumble under Marcus's influence. "Management position at my restaurant, Moretti's. Fine dining establishment that caters to discerning clientele. You'll oversee service operations, staff training, customer relations. The kind of work that matches your education and experience." The offer was generous, probably too generous for someone whose resume included community college and 6 months waiting tables. But Zara understood she wouldn't really be managing a restaurant. She'd be entering Dante Moretti's world, accepting his protection, becoming part of an organization that operated by rules she didn't understand. "What would I owe you in return?" she asked, needing to understand the terms before committing. Dante studied her face, gray eyes reading something in her expression that made him choose his words carefully. "Competent work. Discretion about what you observe. Trust that I have your best interest in mind." He paused. "Nothing you're not willing to give." The careful phrasing suggested he understood her fears, recognized that she was vulnerable, and might assume he expected more than professional service. His restraint was somehow more convincing than any promise could have been. As they sat outside her apartment building, Zara felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. Everything she'd worked for, every careful plan she'd made, had been shattered by Marcus Rothwell's arrogance and James Morrison's cowardice. Dante offered reconstruction, but at the cost of independence she'd never thought to value until it was threatened. The sedan's driver waited patiently while she wrestled with impossible choices. Stay and watch Marcus systematically destroy her ability to earn a living, or accept protection from a man whose reputation carried dangers she couldn't fully comprehend. She looked at Dante, taking in his composed features, the expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the controlled violence she'd witnessed earlier. He'd stepped into her defense without hesitation, handled Marcus with efficient brutality, and now offered employment that would solve her immediate problems. But accepting meant acknowledging that her safe, predictable life was over. "I need to talk to Isaiah," she said finally. "Of course." Dante nodded toward the building. "But Zara, don't underestimate how quickly Marcus can move. The longer you remain exposed, the more danger you're both in." She understood. The conversation with her brother would have to be swift, focused on immediate safety rather than long-term implications. There would be time later to explain how their lives had changed, to help Isaiah understand why his sister's careful plans had been replaced by protection from Portland's most dangerous man. As Zara climbed the stairs to her apartment, ribs aching with each step, she realized she was no longer the same woman who'd served dinner to difficult customers just hours earlier. Marcus Rothwell had broken more than plates when he attacked her. He'd shattered her illusions about safety and fairness, forced her to confront how powerless she really was in a world where wealth and influence trumped justice. But Dante Moretti had shown her another kind of power, the protection that came from aligning with someone who refused to let attacks go unanswered. Tomorrow she would begin learning what it meant to work for a man who locked doors and demanded consequences, who offered employment that came with security she'd never thought to need. The apartment key turned in her trembling fingers as Zara prepared to tell Isaiah that everything was about to change. Moretti's occupied a restored brick building in the Pearl District, its understated exterior revealing nothing of the elegance within. Zara stood on the sidewalk Tuesday morning, studying the simple bronze nameplate beside carved wooden doors that probably cost more than most people's cars. After a week of staying in Dante's secure penthouse with Isaiah, learning the rhythms of their temporary life under protection, she was finally beginning her new position. The difference between Rivington's and Moretti's became clear the moment she stepped inside. Where Rivington's had relied on obvious luxury to impress customers, Moretti's achieved sophistication through restraint. Warm lighting illuminated exposed brick walls lined with carefully curated artwork, while dark wood floors gleamed beneath tables set with crisp white linens and understated glassware. The space felt intimate despite its size, each element chosen for quality rather than flash. "You're early," Dante observed from behind the bar, where he was reviewing inventory sheets with the same attention to detail she'd watched him apply to everything else. Good. I prefer people who understand the value of time. Zara had been trying all week to reconcile the man who'd locked a restaurant full of people with the one who'd patiently helped Isaiah set up a new laptop for his engineering coursework. Dante moved through his penthouse with casual authority, but he'd shown unexpected gentleness when her brother struggled to adjust to their changed circumstances. The contradiction fascinated and unsettled her in equal measure. Sofia Reyes approached from the kitchen, a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to managing chaos. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine as she welcomed Zara to what she clearly considered her domain. Dante tells me you have experience with difficult customers, Sophia said with dry humor. You'll find our clientele more civilized, but no less demanding. Quality expectations here are absolute. The tour revealed a restaurant that operated like a precision instrument. Every aspect of service had been refined through obsessive attention to detail, from the timing of bread delivery to the angle of wine glass placement. Staff moved with practiced efficiency, their uniforms impeccable, their knowledge of menu items encyclopedic. This wasn't just fine dining. It was theater performed nightly for audiences that expected perfection. Dante appeared beside them as Sophia finished explaining inventory systems, his presence somehow making the spacious dining room feel smaller. Your first assignment, he said to Zara, will be learning every aspect of our evening service. I'll be training you personally. The next several hours tested everything Zara thought she knew about restaurant operations. Dante demonstrated wine service with the expertise of a sommelier, explained flavor profiles with the precision of a chef, and critiqued table settings with an eye for detail that bordered on obsessive. His standards were impossibly high, but he taught with patience that surprised her, correcting mistakes without condescension, building her understanding systematically. The work itself felt familiar, but watching Dante perform these tasks revealed layers to his character she hadn't expected. His hands moved with surprising grace as he folded napkins. His voice softened when he explained the provenance of specific wines, and his face showed genuine pleasure when she mastered a complicated service technique on her third attempt. You learn quickly, he observed as she successfully executed the ritual of tableside Caesar salad preparation. That's rare in people who haven't grown up in this environment. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Zara found herself studying his profile as he adjusted the height of a centerpiece, noting the way concentration softened his features, making him seem younger than his 32 years. Working closely with him created an intimacy that had nothing to do with the romantic tension humming between them and everything to do with shared focus on achieving excellence. Marco Torino arrived during the afternoon prep, Dante's lieutenant, bringing the controlled energy of a man comfortable with violence. He was younger than Dante, maybe 28, with dark eyes that missed nothing and the kind of lean build that suggested speed rather than brute strength. His interaction with Zara was professionally cordial, but she sensed him evaluating her presence in Dante's world with careful attention. How's she adapting? Marco asked Dante quietly, assuming Zara couldn't hear from across the dining room where she was practicing wine presentations. Better than expected, Dante replied, his voice carrying approval that made Zara's pulse quicken despite herself. She understands quality, respects the work. That's more than most people bring to this business. The conversation continued in Italian, rapid exchanges that Zara couldn't follow but that seemed to involve reports and decisions about matters unrelated to restaurant operations. She caught Marcus's name mentioned several times, along with words that sounded ominous even in a language she didn't understand. The reminder of the external threat sent ice through her veins, but also reinforced why Dante's protection had become necessary. Isaiah arrived after his classes ended, backpack slung over his shoulder, an expression carefully neutral. At 19, her younger brother possessed their mother's intelligence and their father's stubborn pride, a combination that made him resist accepting help even when circumstances demanded it. He'd struggled with their new living arrangements, uncomfortable with luxury he hadn't earned and protection that felt like charity. Dante greeted Isaiah with the same courtesy he'd shown when helping with homework setup, but without the careful distance adults often maintained with teenagers. He asked thoughtful questions about Isaiah's engineering coursework, listened to detailed explanations of thermodynamics problems, and offered genuine encouragement about academic challenges. The interaction revealed yet another facet of Dante's character, his ability to connect with people across generational and cultural boundaries. "Your sister has natural instincts for this work," Dante told Isaiah as they watched Zara coordinate with Sophia on staff scheduling. "She understands that excellence in service isn't about subservience. It's about creating experiences people value." Isaiah nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to understand that Dante saw Zara's potential rather than her vulnerability. The distinction mattered to a young man who'd watched his sister sacrifice her own ambitions to support his education. The evening service proceeded smoothly until Zara's phone rang during the dinner rush. Marcus Rothwell's name appeared on the screen, sending alarm through her system even as she recognized she needed to answer. Ignoring his calls would only escalate his harassment, but taking them during service felt like bringing poison into Dante's carefully controlled environment. She stepped into the kitchen corridor, accepting the call with trembling fingers. "Hello, Zara." Marcus's voice carried false pleasantness that made her skin crawl. "How are you enjoying your new employment? I hear you found quite the protector." The deliberate pause before the word protector suggested Marcus understood exactly who Dante was and what protection from him implied. Zara's mouth went dry as she realized Marcus wasn't backing down despite their earlier confrontation. "What do you want?" she managed, proud when her voice came out steady. "I want you to understand that this isn't over, sweetheart. You caused me considerable embarrassment, and your boyfriend's theatrics only made things worse. There are consequences for that kind of humiliation." The threat was clear, even wrapped in polite language. Marcus had connections, influence, resources that Dante's protection might not fully neutralize. He could make their lives complicated in ways that avoided direct confrontation while still causing maximum damage. "Stay away from me and my family," Zara said firmly. Marcus's laughter was ugly. "Your family? Oh, Zara, I think you misunderstand how this works. Your little brother is quite the scholar, isn't he? Portland State has such a lovely campus, so many opportunities for accidents to happen to distracted students." The line went dead before Zara could respond, leaving her staring at her phone while terror flooded her system. Marcus wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was targeting Isaiah directly, the one person she'd do anything to protect. She stood in the corridor trying to process what she'd just heard, hands shaking as the implications crashed over her. Marcus had escalated beyond harassment into active threats against her brother, the kind of specific menace that suggested surveillance and planning rather than empty bluster. Dante appeared beside her with the silent grace she was learning to expect, his presence somehow both calming and alerting her to how completely she'd lost control of her emotional state. His gray eyes took in her expression, the phone still clutched in her trembling hand, and his features hardened with the dangerous focus she'd witnessed during their first meeting. "What did he say?" Dante asked quietly, his tone suggesting that Marcus Rothwell had just made a significant tactical error. Before Zara could answer, her feet tangled with each other as she tried to step away from the wall, her balance compromised by the adrenaline flooding her system. She would have fallen if Dante hadn't moved instinctively, his hands catching her shoulders to steady her against his chest. The contact sent electricity through her entire body, awareness of his strength, his warmth, the controlled power in his careful touch overwhelming every other sensation. She could smell his cologne, feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, sense the tension in his frame that suggested violence held carefully in check. For a moment that stretched beyond reasonable time, they stood frozen in that position, her hands pressed against his chest, his fingers gentle on her shoulders despite the fury building in his expression. Zara looked up into gray eyes that had darkened with something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the attraction that had been building between them all week. Dante's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on her shoulders, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to meet her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment stretched until the sound of Sophia calling her name from the dining room broke the spell, reminding them both that they were standing in a restaurant corridor during evening service, that there were responsibilities and dangers that couldn't be ignored for the sake of whatever was developing between them. Dante stepped back carefully, ensuring she was steady before releasing his hold. But his eyes remained focused on her face with an attention that made her pulse race. "Tell me what Marcus said," he repeated, his voice rougher than it had been moments before. As Zara repeated the phone conversation, watching Dante's expression grow increasingly dangerous, she realized that Marcus Rothwell had badly underestimated the man whose protection he was challenging. But she also understood that accepting Dante's help meant stepping deeper into a world where threats were met with decisive action, where protection came at the cost of the safe, predictable life she'd been trying to build. Standing in that corridor, still feeling the warmth of Dante's touch on her shoulders, Zara recognized that her choice had already been made. Marcus's escalation had eliminated any possibility of returning to her previous life, but Dante's response to the threat, the immediate shift into protective mode, suggested that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The question now was whether she was brave enough to acknowledge what was happening between them, or wise enough to recognize that some kinds of safety came with prices she might not be prepared to pay. The last customer left Moretti's just after midnight, and Zara found herself alone in the dining room with Dante as the staff finished closing procedures. 2 weeks of working together had created a rhythm between them, an easy collaboration that felt natural despite the underlying tension that sparked every time their hands brushed while setting tables or their eyes met across the room during service. Tonight felt different, charged with the kind of electricity that came from spending hours in close proximity while pretending not to notice the way he moved, the careful attention he paid to everything she said, the way his presence made her hyper-aware of her own heartbeat. Marcus's threats had escalated daily. Phone calls filled with increasingly specific details about Isaiah's schedule that proved he was being watched. But here in Dante's carefully controlled environment, surrounded by warm lighting and the lingering sense of rosemary and wine, the outside world felt temporarily held at bay. "Good service tonight," Dante observed, settling into the chair across from her at table 6, the same spot where he'd been dining when Marcus attacked her. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. But where that night had been about protection and power, this felt like something else entirely. "Sophia says you're ready to start training other staff members," he continued, loosening his tie with movements that drew Zara's attention to the strong column of his throat, the way his expensive shirt stretched across broad shoulders. "Your instincts for reading customers are exceptional." The compliment warmed her, but Zara found herself studying Dante's face in the soft lighting, noting the tiredness around his gray eyes that spoke of responsibilities extending far beyond restaurant management. She'd begun to understand that Moretti's was simultaneously his passion project and his legitimate front, a place where he could exercise the same attention to detail and demand for excellence that made him effective in his other pursuits. "You look exhausted," she said quietly, surprising herself with the observation. "When do you sleep?" Dante's smile was rueful. "Sleep is a luxury I don't often afford myself. Too many moving pieces, too many people depending on decisions I make." He paused, studying her face. "What about you? I know this transition hasn't been easy." The question opened something in Zara's chest that she'd been carefully keeping closed. 2 weeks of living under protection, watching Isaiah struggle to adjust to circumstances neither of them had chosen, pretending that her old life hadn't been completely shattered by Marcus's vindictiveness. She'd been maintaining the same professional composure that had carried her through years of difficult customers and financial struggles. But Dante's direct attention made those defenses feel suddenly fragile. "I keep thinking about how different everything was a month ago," she admitted. "Working 3 jobs to pay for Isaiah's textbooks, worried about making rent, but believing that if I just worked hard enough, everything would be stable. Safe." She laughed without humor. "I was so naive about what safety actually means." Dante leaned back in his chair, his expression encouraging her to continue. "What happened to your father?" The question shouldn't have surprised her, but hearing it spoken aloud made Zara's throat tighten with emotions she'd spent years learning to suppress. Isaiah had been 10 when their father left, young enough that his memories were filtered through a child's understanding, but Zara had been 16, old enough to understand that David Williams had simply decided his family was more burden than he wanted to carry. "He left when Isaiah was 10, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Came home from work one day, packed a bag, and announced he couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Said he never wanted to be a father, that he'd tried for years but couldn't pretend anymore. Dante's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tightening that suggested her words had hit something personal. My mother worked 2 jobs after that, trying to keep us in the same school district, maintain some stability for Isaiah. She died my senior year of high school. Heart attack brought on by exhaustion and stress. Zara felt tears threatening for the first time in months, the careful control she'd maintained beginning to crack under Dante's steady attention. I promised her I'd make sure Isaiah got opportunities she never had, that he'd never have to choose between education and survival. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Zara had never spoken those words aloud, never acknowledged how completely her life had been shaped by that promise, how every decision since had been filtered through her determination to give Isaiah the future their mother had wanted for him. That's why you work so hard, Dante said quietly. Not just survival. Legacy. The understanding in his voice broke something loose in Zara's chest, tears she'd been holding back for years finally spilling over. She pressed her hands to her face, embarrassed by the display of emotion but unable to stop the release of pressure that had been building since the night Marcus attacked her. Dante moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, his hands gentle as they covered her wrists, drawing her fingers away from her face with careful patience. When she looked at him through tear-blurred vision, his gray eyes held none of the pity she'd expected, only recognition of grief that matched something in his own experience. I lost both parents when I was 22, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Car accident that wasn't really an accident, but I couldn't prove it. One day I was a college graduate with plans for law school. The next I was responsible for an organization, for people who depended on decisions I wasn't prepared to make. His thumb stroked gently across her knuckles as he continued. I understand about promises to the dead, about carrying weight that doesn't feel like choice. He paused, his gaze intense on her face. But Zara, you're not alone in this anymore. The words, spoken with quiet conviction, made something shift fundamentally in her chest. For 7 years, she'd carried the full weight of her family's survival, made every choice through the lens of what would keep Isaiah safe and fed and in school. Dante's protection had removed immediate financial pressure, but his understanding went deeper than that. He recognized the emotional burden she'd been carrying, the crushing sense of responsibility that shaped every aspect of her life. She looked into his eyes, seeing reflected there the same kind of determination that drove her own choices, and realized that what she felt for him went far beyond gratitude for protection or attraction to his undeniable appeal. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, watching him interact with Isaiah with genuine interest, seeing him demand excellence from himself and others, witnessing the careful way he'd helped her rebuild her professional confidence, she'd begun to fall in love with Dante Moretti. The realization should have terrified her, but sitting in his restaurant after midnight with his hands warm on hers, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Dante seemed to read the shift in her expression, his own features softening as he studied her face. Very slowly, giving her time to pull away, he leaned closer. When she didn't move, didn't retreat, he brushed his lips against hers with such gentleness that it made her breath catch. The kiss was nothing like she'd expected from a man with his reputation. Soft, questioning, carefully controlled in a way that let her set the pace. Zara found herself leaning into him, her hands sliding into his hair as he deepened the contact with reverent attention to her response. She could taste wine on his lips, feel the warmth of his breath, sense the rigid control he maintained even as his hands trembled slightly against her face. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Dante rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first night, he admitted quietly. But I needed to be sure it was what you wanted, not just gratitude or proximity. It's not gratitude, Zara whispered, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. This is real. Before Dante could respond, his phone buzzed with an emergency alert that made his entire body tense. He glanced at the screen, and his expression went cold with the kind of fury she'd only seen once before. What is it? She asked, though his face already told her it was bad news. Marcus was at Portland State this afternoon, Dante said, his voice deadly calm. He approached Isaiah after his thermodynamics class, started a conversation about engineering internships. Made it clear he knew your brother's schedule, his professors, where he eats lunch. Ice flooded Zara's system as the implications hit her. Marcus wasn't just making phone calls anymore. He was physically stalking Isaiah, making direct contact in ways that proved how vulnerable her brother really was despite their attempts at protection. "We're moving you tonight," Dante continued, already standing and reaching for his jacket. "Both of you, to the penthouse permanently. No more traveling back and forth, no more exposure during commutes. This stops now." Zara nodded, understanding that their fragile peace had just been shattered by Marcus's escalation. But as Dante helped her to her feet, his hands still gentle despite the controlled violence radiating from his frame, she realized that crossing the line from protection to personal relationship meant she was no longer just accepting his help. She was choosing his world, with all the dangers and complications that entailed. The kiss they'd shared had changed everything between them, but Marcus's direct threat against Isaiah meant there was no going back to the careful distance they'd been maintaining. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating in ways that made her question everything she'd thought she knew about safety, love, and the prices she was willing to pay for both. As they left Moretti's together, Dante's hand protective on her lower back, Zara understood that she'd finally found something worth the risk. The question now was whether she was brave enough to fight for it when Marcus inevitably forced them to make that choice. 3 weeks of living in Dante's penthouse had created an intimacy that went far beyond the careful distance they'd initially maintained. Zara woke each morning to the smell of coffee he'd prepared, fell asleep each night to the sound of his voice as he conducted business calls in Italian, learned the rhythm of a life where luxury served function rather than display. The space felt like sanctuary, 30 floors above the city with windows that revealed Portland spread out like a promise of safety. Their relationship had deepened into something neither of them had expected when this began. Dante's initial offer of protection had evolved into partnership, their shared work at Moretti's creating collaboration that extended into every aspect of their daily existence. He sought her opinion on menu changes, included her in staff scheduling decisions, trusted her judgment about customer service issues with the kind of respect she'd never experienced from previous employers. But it was the quiet moments that revealed how completely her feelings had developed. Watching him help Isaiah with calculus homework, seeing his genuine pride when her brother mastered difficult concepts. The way Dante listened when she talked about her mother's dreams for their family, how he remembered details about her goals for expanding restaurant operations. The careful attention he paid to her comfort, ensuring she had space when she needed it, closeness when she wanted it, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. Last night had changed everything between them. Their first time together had been everything she'd hoped and feared, Dante's careful reverence making her feel precious rather than possessed. He'd taken his time despite the desire she could see burning in his gray eyes, mapping every inch of her skin with gentle hands and whispered endearments, ensuring her pleasure before seeking his own. Afterward, she'd fallen asleep in his arms feeling safer than she'd ever imagined possible. This morning brought reality crashing back. Marco arrived before dawn with intelligence that made Dante's expression go cold with dangerous focus. Marcus Rothwell wasn't just harassing them out of wounded pride. He was desperately trying to curry favor with the Torino family, Portland's rival organization that had been testing boundaries for months. His gambling debts to their operations had reached crisis levels, and destroying Dante's reputation by proving he couldn't protect what was his offered Marcus a path to forgiveness. The information explained the escalating threats, the specific knowledge of Isaiah's schedule, the boldness that had seemed reckless for a man with no criminal experience. Marcus wasn't acting alone anymore. He'd aligned himself with people who understood exactly how to apply pressure where it would cause maximum damage. "We in this today," Dante said quietly, studying surveillance photos that showed Marcus meeting with known Torino associates. "He's crossed lines that can't be uncrossed." Zara felt ice in her veins as she watched Dante shift into the mode she'd only glimpsed before, controlled violence radiating from his frame as he planned responses to threats against his organization. This was the man whose reputation had terrified Marcus into submission during their first meeting, whose protection had given her sanctuary but whose world carried prices she was still learning to understand. Isaiah left for campus with additional security, two of Dante's men shadowing him with instructions to prevent any contact with unauthorized individuals. The precautions felt excessive until Zara's phone rang at 11:30 with Marcus's number displayed on the screen. "Hello, sweetheart." Marcus's voice carried satisfaction that made her stomach clench. "I think you'll find today's conversation more productive than our previous exchanges. What do you want?" Zara managed, signaling to Dante, who immediately began coordinating tracking procedures. "I want you to meet me at Pioneer Courthouse Square in 30 minutes, Marcus said conversationally. "Come alone, no bodyguards, no boyfriend. Just you and me having a civilized discussion about your future." "I'm not meeting you anywhere," Zara replied, but Marcus's laughter cut her off. "Oh, but I think you will. You see, I've had a lovely chat with your brother this morning. Bright young man, very dedicated to his studies. It would be such a shame if his academic career were interrupted by unfortunate circumstances." The line went dead, leaving Zara staring at her phone while terror flooded her system. Marcus had moved beyond threats into action, and Isaiah's safety was no longer theoretical. She tried calling her brother's number, but it went straight to voicemail, the cheerful recording she'd heard hundreds of times now sounding ominous rather than familiar. Dante's phone buzzed with an emergency alert from the security team. His expression went deadly as he read the message, gray eyes hardening with the kind of fury that suggested Marcus Rothwell had badly miscalculated his opponent. "Isaiah never made it to campus," Dante said, his voice carefully controlled. "His security detail found his backpack abandoned in Pioneer Square, along with a note directing you to come alone." The words hit Zara like physical blows. Marcus had kidnapped her brother, the one person she'd sworn to protect, the promise she'd made to their dying mother. Everything else became secondary to the crushing need to get Isaiah back safely, to fix the situation that her association with Dante had created. "I'm going to meet him," she said quietly, already moving toward the door. Dante caught her arm, his grip firm but gentle. "You're not going anywhere near Marcus Rothwell. This is what he wants, to draw you out where you're vulnerable." Zara jerked away, panic making her voice sharp. "He has Isaiah. My brother is in danger because of me, because of this situation. I won't let Marcus hurt him to get to you." The accusation hung between them, revealing the fear Zara had been carrying since accepting Dante's protection. That loving him, allowing herself to become part of his world, would ultimately cost Isaiah the future she'd sacrificed everything to secure. Marcus had found her greatest vulnerability and was exploiting it with surgical precision. "This isn't about me," Dante said, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. Marcus aligned himself with the Torino family. "This is about territory, respect, power dynamics you don't understand. Walking into his trap won't save your brother. It'll give him leverage to demand more." Zara felt something crack inside her chest as she realized how completely different their perspectives were on protection and partnership. Dante thought strategically, weighing risks and benefits with the cold calculation that kept him alive in his dangerous world. But Isaiah wasn't a strategic consideration to her. He was everything, the center around which her entire life revolved. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "Isaiah is my responsibility. I promised my mother I'd keep him safe, that I'd make sure he had opportunities she never did. I can't let Marcus destroy that because I fell in love with you." The words revealed everything she'd been trying not to acknowledge. That accepting Dante's love meant accepting the dangers that came with his protection. That Marcus's escalation was directly connected to their relationship, making her feelings a liability that threatened the one person she couldn't afford to lose. Dante's expression shifted as he processed what she'd said, recognizing the impossible choice Marcus had forced her to make. Love him and endanger Isaiah, or sacrifice their relationship to protect her brother. It was strategic brilliance that exploited the exact vulnerability Marcus had identified weeks ago. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself," Dante said firmly. "We'll get Isaiah back, but not by walking into an obvious trap." Before Zara could argue further, her phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. A photo of Isaiah tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse, his face showing fear, but no obvious injuries yet. The accompanying message was simple: 20 minutes. Come alone or consequences escalate. The image shattered what remained of Zara's rational thinking. Isaiah looked so young, so terrified, exactly like the 10-year-old boy who'd clung to her after their father left. Every instinct screamed at her to do whatever it took to get him back safely, regardless of the risks to herself or the strategic implications Dante was calculating. She pocketed her phone and headed for the elevator, knowing Dante would try to stop her, but unable to care about anything beyond saving her brother. The promise to their mother mattered more than her own safety, more than her relationship with Dante, more than the consequences Marcus might demand. Dante moved faster than she'd expected, blocking her path to the door with the fluid grace that reminded her how dangerous he could be when circumstances required it. But his hands were gentle when he caught her shoulders, his voice soft despite the steel in his gray eyes. Zara, listen to me. Marcus wants you to panic, to act emotionally instead of strategically. The moment you walk into that square, he has leverage against both of us. But if we move carefully, we can get Isaiah back without giving Marcus what he's really after. She looked into his face, seeing the man who'd locked a restaurant full of people to protect her, who'd offered employment when she lost her job, who'd made space in his carefully controlled life for both her and Isaiah. But she also saw the criminal strategist who thought in terms of territory and respect, whose world operated by rules that prioritized power over individual safety. I can't risk Isaiah's life on strategy, she said quietly. He's 19 years old, Dante. He doesn't deserve to suffer because I made choices that put him in danger. Dante's hands tightened on her shoulders, his expression showing the pain her words had caused. You think I don't understand about protecting family? About promises that matter more than your own life? His voice roughened with emotion. Everything I've built, every decision I make, is about honoring obligations to people who depend on me. I would never ask you to sacrifice Isaiah. The sincerity in his voice made Zara hesitate, recognizing that her panic had blinded her to the fact that Dante understood responsibility as completely as she did. His organization was built on loyalty, on protecting people who trusted him with their lives. He wouldn't approach Isaiah's rescue carelessly any more than she would abandon her brother to Marcus's threats. But time was running out, and the photo of Isaiah's frightened face burned in her memory like a brand. Every minute they spent planning was another minute her brother remained in Marcus's hands, subject to whatever escalation he might decide was necessary to force her compliance. Trust me, Dante said quietly, his gray eyes intense on her face. Let me handle this the way it needs to be handled. I promise you, we'll get Isaiah back safely. Looking into his face, Zara realized that trusting him meant more than accepting his protection or allowing him into her heart. It meant believing that his commitment to her extended to the people she loved. That partnership meant sharing both the burden and the solutions. Marcus had engineered this crisis to force exactly this choice, betting that she would choose independent action over collaborative strategy. The elevator chimed softly, and Marco emerged with two other men, all of them armed and moving with purpose that suggested Dante had been coordinating rescue operations even while trying to convince her not to walk into Marcus's trap. The realization that he'd been planning to save Isaiah regardless of her decision made something loosen in her chest. How do we get him back? She asked quietly, finally understanding that trust meant accepting Dante's expertise in handling situations she couldn't navigate alone. Dante's smile was cold with promise as he outlined the plan that would end Marcus Rothwell's threats permanently while ensuring Isaiah's safe return. But even as Zara agreed to wait at the penthouse while his team moved into position, she wondered whether their relationship could survive the crisis that had forced them to confront how differently they approached love, protection, and the prices they were willing to pay to keep each other safe. The warehouse in southeast Portland looked abandoned from the outside, its broken windows and rusted fire escapes suggesting years of neglect. But Dante's intelligence network had identified it as Marcus Rothwell's meeting location with Torino family associates, the kind of neutral ground where desperate men made deals that usually ended in blood. Zara waited in the penthouse, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as the city sparkled below, every minute stretching like hours while Dante's team moved into position. Marco had explained the plan with military precision: simultaneous entry from 3 points, neutralize any guards, secure Isaiah's location, eliminate the threat permanently. The clinical description of violence made her stomach clench, but she understood that Marcus had crossed lines that required decisive response. When Dante's call finally came through at 4:30, Zara's hands shook as she answered. "Isaiah is safe," Dante said without preamble, his voice carrying relief that made her knees weak. "Minor dehydration, some bruising from restraints, but no serious injuries. He's en route to the penthouse with medical support." The wave of gratitude that crashed over her was so intense it left her gasping. For 6 hours, she'd carried the terror that Marcus might hurt her brother to force her compliance, that the promise to her mother might be broken because she'd fallen in love with a dangerous man. Hearing that Isaiah was safe felt like resurrection. "What about Marcus?" she managed to ask. "Marcus Rothwell will never threaten anyone again," Dante replied with finality that suggested the real estate developer's story had reached its conclusion. "The Torino family's interest in our territory has also been discouraged." The euphemism didn't disguise what had happened, but Zara found she couldn't summon sympathy for Marcus. He'd kidnapped her brother, threatened an innocent 19-year-old to settle adult grievances, crossed every line that separated conflict from evil. Whatever consequences Dante had delivered were Marcus's own choice. But as relief faded, other emotions surfaced. The crisis had revealed fundamental differences in how she and Dante approached protection, love, and the prices they were willing to pay for safety. Her instinct had been to sacrifice herself to save Isaiah, while his had been strategic patience that seemed cold despite its effectiveness. The gap between their worldviews felt suddenly vast. When Isaiah arrived 30 minutes later, pale but unharmed, Zara held him tighter than she had since he was small, feeling his familiar solidity and knowing how close she'd come to losing everything that mattered. The paramedic confirmed minor injuries consistent with being restrained, but no lasting damage, prescribing rest and fluids while carefully not asking questions about how the kidnapping had been resolved. "I'm sorry," Isaiah said quietly as the medical team departed. "I should have been more careful, should have noticed I was being followed." The self-blame in his voice broke Zara's heart. "None of this is your fault," she assured him fiercely. "You did nothing wrong. This happened because of adult conflicts you never should have been involved in." Dante stood across the room, maintaining careful distance while she comforted her brother, but his expression showed the same relief she felt. When Isaiah finally fell asleep on the guest room bed, exhaustion overcoming adrenaline, Zara found herself alone with the man who'd saved her brother's life while forcing her to confront how little she understood about the world she'd entered. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the gratitude threatening to overwhelm her. "You don't need to thank me," Dante replied quietly. "Isaiah's safety matters to me because he matters to you." The statement should have been comforting, but it highlighted the conditional nature of his concern. Isaiah mattered because she loved him, not because Dante had independent feelings for her brother. It was logical, reasonable, exactly how most people prioritize their emotional investments. But it also emphasized how different Dante's world was from the one she'd been trying to build, where love meant accepting responsibilities that extended beyond personal benefit. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, while Isaiah was missing, "about whether I belong in this life." Dante went very still, gray eyes sharpening with a tension that suggested he understood exactly what she was considering. "You're having second thoughts about us." It wasn't a question. Zara looked at him across the elegant living space that had become home over the past month, taking in his expensive clothes, his controlled posture, the careful way he monitored her expression for clues about what she might say next. Everything about Dante Moretti suggested power, competence, the ability to handle any crisis through strategic thinking and decisive action. But loving him meant accepting that crises would continue to arise, that the safety he provided came with costs she was still learning to calculate. "Marcus targeted Isaiah to get to me, and I targeted me to get to you," she said slowly. "This won't be the last time someone tries to use the people I love as leverage. Can I live with that uncertainty? Can I ask Isaiah to live with it?" Dante's expression remained neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had landed like blows. He'd offered her everything he could give: protection, partnership, love that transformed both their lives, but he couldn't offer a guarantee that his world would never touch hers in dangerous ways. "You're right," he said finally. "Loving me means accepting risks you never chose." I can't promise that threats won't arise, that people won't see you and Isaiah as ways to challenge my authority. His voice roughened slightly. But I can promise that anyone who tries will face consequences that discourage others from making the same mistake. The careful phrasing revealed everything about how Dante approached love. It was strategic, protective, built around his ability to eliminate threats through superior force and planning. He loved her enough to kill for her. But could he love her enough to be vulnerable with her? That's not enough, Zara said quietly, surprised by her own clarity. I don't need you to promise me safety, Dante. I need you to promise me partnership. Real partnership, where we make decisions together instead of you protecting me from information you think I can't handle. Dante stared at her for a long moment, and she watched him process what she was really asking. Not just protection, but equality. Not just love, but trust. Not just a place in his world, but influence over how that world operated when it touched the people she cared about. You want to be consulted about security decisions that affect your family, he said slowly. I want to understand the threats we face so I can make informed choices about the risks I'm willing to accept, Zara corrected. I want to know when situations are developing so I'm not blindsided by crises. I want to be your partner, not your protected asset. The distinction mattered more than she'd realized until speaking it aloud. Marcus had succeeded in creating conflict between them because Dante's protective instincts had kept her isolated from information that affected her safety. True partnership required transparency that went beyond his comfort zone, vulnerability that his training had taught him to avoid. Dante was quiet for so long that Zara began to think he couldn't make the adjustment she was asking for. His entire life had been built around controlling information, compartmentalizing risks, protecting people by limiting what they knew about dangers they couldn't influence. Opening that process to her input meant fundamentally changing how he operated. When I was 12, Dante said finally, my father took me to a meeting where two rival families were negotiating territory disputes. He wanted me to see how real power worked, how men solved problems when law couldn't touch them. His voice grew distant with memory. 3 hours of polite conversation, everyone smiling, everyone agreeing. Then one man said something that crossed a line, and within 30 seconds, 4 people were dead. Zara listened without interrupting, understanding that he was sharing something essential about how his world had shaped his approach to protection and partnership. My father pulled me aside afterward and explained that information was the most dangerous weapon anyone could carry. That knowing too much about other people's conflicts made you a target, but knowing too little made you vulnerable. He said the key to survival was controlling exactly what people knew and when they knew it. Dante looked at her directly. I've been protecting you the way my father protected my mother. But you're not asking for the same kind of protection she wanted. The admission revealed everything about why transparency felt dangerous to him, but also why it might be necessary for their relationship to survive. His parents' marriage had worked because his mother had been willing to remain insulated from his father's business. But Zara had different needs, different strengths, a different relationship to risk and responsibility. Your mother didn't grow up supporting a family, making decisions that affected someone else's future, Zara observed gently. I've been responsible for other people's safety since I was 16. I'm not asking you to eliminate danger. I'm asking you to trust me to handle information like the adult I am. Dante's smile was rueful. You want partnership that includes the ugly parts. I want partnership that includes all the parts, she corrected. Beautiful and ugly, safe and dangerous, strategic and emotional. I want to build something with you, not just be protected by you. The conversation stretched between them, years of conditioning warring with the recognition that what they had together was worth adapting for. Dante had spent his adult life believing that love meant shielding people from harsh realities, but Zara was asking him to believe that love could mean facing those realities together. All right, he said finally. Full partnership. Information sharing, collaborative decisions, transparency about threats and responses. His gray eyes held her steadily. But Zara, that means accepting responsibility for consequences of decisions we make together. Are you prepared for that weight? The question acknowledged what she was really asking for. Not just influence over their shared life, but accountability for outcomes that might include violence, moral complexity, choices that couldn't be undone. Partnership with Dante Moretti meant becoming complicit in his world, not just benefiting from its protection. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'm prepared. Something shifted in Dante's expression, recognition that she understood exactly what she was accepting and had chosen it anyway. He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to retreat from the commitment she was making. When he reached her, his hands were gentle as they cupped her face, thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with reverent attention. "I love you," he said quietly. "Not because you're beautiful, though you are. Not because you're strong, though you are. I love you because you see exactly who I am and choose me anyway." The declaration held weight beyond romance, acknowledgement that she'd looked into his dangerous world and decided it was worth the costs. Zara felt tears threatening as she realized how completely their crisis had clarified what she wanted. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "All of you, including the parts that scare me." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper and more desperate, flavored with relief and commitment and the recognition that they'd chosen each other despite every rational reason to walk away. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Dante rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "Be my partner in everything, officially and permanently." The proposal wasn't what Zara had expected, no elaborate planning or romantic setting, just direct honesty about what he wanted their future to look like. But it felt perfect, exactly right for a relationship that had been built on crisis and choice rather than conventional courtship. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how easily the decision came. "Yes to marriage. Yes to partnership. Yes to building something together that's worth whatever it costs." 3 months later, Zara stood in the same restaurant where Marcus Rothwell had attacked her, but everything about the space had been transformed. Moretti's had been closed to regular service for the evening, filled instead with flowers and candles and people who'd become family over the months of building their life together. Sophia had coordinated every detail with the precision of a military operation, while Marco had handled security with the thoroughness that Zara had learned to appreciate rather than resent. The wedding ceremony was small but elegant, officiated by a judge whose discretion Dante trusted and attended by the extended family that formed around organizations like his. Isaiah stood as her witness, handsome in his new suit and proud in ways that had nothing to do with the money Dante had spent on education and everything to do with seeing his sister choose happiness over fear. When the judge pronounced them married, Dante's kiss tasted like promise and partnership, like a future they'd build together regardless of what challenges arose. The reception that followed showcased everything Zara loved about their collaboration. Dante's attention to detail combined with her understanding of what made people feel welcome and celebrated. 6 months after the wedding, Zara woke to morning sickness that made everything suddenly clear. She and Dante had been so focused on building their partnership that they hadn't discussed children beyond abstract someday conversations. But holding the pregnancy test in her hand made her realize how much she wanted this expansion of their family. Dante found her sitting on their bathroom floor, staring at the plastic stick that had changed everything. His expression cycled through surprise, concern, and then joy so pure it made her breath catch. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about how pregnancy might fit into their carefully negotiated life. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Dante said, kneeling beside her and pulling her into his arms. Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful, protective, already completely in love with someone I haven't met yet. His hands were gentle as they settled on her still flat stomach. "But yes, happy." The baby was born 7 months later, a daughter with Dante's gray eyes and Zara's stubborn determination, who seemed to understand from birth that she was surrounded by people who would do anything to keep her safe. Isaiah had graduated by then, his engineering degree opening doors to a career designing security systems for legitimate businesses with connections to Dante's organization. Standing in the nursery they'd decorated together, watching Dante hold their daughter with the same careful reverence he brought to everything precious, Zara marveled at how completely her life had transformed. 2 years ago, she'd been a waitress struggling to pay rent, accepting condescension from customers who saw her as expendable. Now she was partner in a growing restaurant empire, wife to a man whose love had given her strength she'd never known she possessed, mother to a child who would grow up understanding that safety came from family rather than submission. The final test of their partnership came when little Elena was 6 months old and someone foolish enough to think that new parenthood made them vulnerable attempted to challenge Dante's territory. But this time, when crisis arose, Zara was included in every discussion, consulted about every decision, trusted to help craft responses that would eliminate threats while protecting what they'd built together. Marcus Rothwell had been wrong about power dynamics, wrong about what made people vulnerable. True strength came not from isolation or dominance, but from partnership that acknowledged both love and danger, that faced threats together rather than separately. As Zara nursed their daughter, while Dante planned responses to challenges that would never touch their family directly, she understood that she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Security that came from choice rather than chance, love that strengthened rather than weakened her, a future built on partnership that could weather whatever storms arose. The woman who'd been shoved by an arrogant customer had discovered that real protection came from standing with someone who saw her worth, chose her strength, and built something together that was greater than what either could achieve alone. And in the end, that revelation had been worth every risk they'd faced to find it. What's it like when someone decides you're worth protecting, worth choosing, worth building a life with despite all the reasons it might be easier to walk away? Zara had learned the answer, and it was more beautiful than anything she'd dared to hope for when that terrible night began with broken dishes and ended with a man who locked doors to keep her safe.